Hello and welcome to the RealTime Fantasy Sports Show. I'm Jeff Paur, senior writer with RealTime Fantasy Sports. On today's show, I'm going to give you my start, sits, and sleepers for week 9 of the fantasy football season. Moving right along here over the halfway point of the fantasy season. Hopefully things are going well for you. Last week on the show, I went 19-7 on my picks. Really happy about that. That was my best week of the season. I'm up to 118-90 overall, 57%. Pretty solid. Hopefully I can keep it going this week and give you some good options for all of your fantasy teams. And you have a lot of success in week 9. As always, we do quarterbacks, running backs, and receivers. 3 starts, 3 seats, 3 sits, and a sleeper. Easy for me to say. And then at the tight end position, I'll give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper there. We start with the QBs. And my first start there is Daniel Jones of the Indianapolis Colts. He had his third 3-touchdown game of the season last week. Hard to believe. Daniel Jones has been absolutely fantastic this year. 25 plus fantasy points, 3 straight games, multiple touchdowns, all but 2 games this year. He's been so consistent. I don't think anyone saw this coming, but he's been absolutely phenomenal. I think he keeps it going this week against Pittsburgh. They allow the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks this year and have given up 300 plus passing yards 3 of 4 games. So this is a great matchup for Jones to keep rolling in week 9. My next start at quarterback is Sam Darnold of the Seattle Seahawks, another guy with a new team that I think's played pretty well. He did have a down fantasy game his last time out, but that was against a really good Texans defense. He had 22 plus fantasy points each of his 2 games before that week 7 dud, and he plays Washington this week. This is a really advantageous matchup for Darnold. They allow the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, 235 plus passing yards, 3 straight games they have allowed. So I like Darnold to rebound from his last poor showing and get it going once again. He's played really well most of the season for Seattle. My last start at QB is Joe Flacco of the Cincinnati Bengals. So it's 3 QBs that I have starts that are all with new teams this year. Flacco's actually on his second team already this year, but he's been absolutely outstanding since his move to Cincinnati. He is 6th in fantasy quarterback scoring his last 3 games. Those are all with Cincinnati. He has at least 20 fantasy points all 3 games with the Bengals, 2 straight 3-touchdown games. He gets the Bears. They allow the 8th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. They allowed 30 points last week to backup quarterback Tyler Huntley. I think Flacco is a great play once again in week 9. My sits at QB. My first one is CJ Stroud of Houston. He actually looked fantastic last week against a good 49ers secondary. He threw for 318 yards and 2 touchdowns, and that was without his number 1 receiver, Nico Collins. But San Francisco did get banged up in that game with some injuries, so I think his numbers were skewed a little. Stroud has actually been really up and down throughout the year. He has fewer than 18 fantasy points each of his first 3 games this season, and now he gets the Broncos this week. I know they're without cornerback Patrick Surtain, but this defense is still really good. They have some great pressure to the quarterback. They can really get after that quarterback, and I think that's going to give Stroud some problems. And they also have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to QBs this year. So I look for Stroud to have a bit of a down showing in week 9. My next sit at QB is Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers. Best game of the season last week. He scored 32 fantasy points. Great game for him. But again, much like Stroud, he's been up and down throughout the season. He has fewer than 19 fantasy points. He had fewer than 19 fantasy points his 3 previous games before last week. And he gets the Panthers this week. They've allowed fewer than 170 passing yards each of their last 2 games. They allowed the 11th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks for the season. So while the Panthers aren't a very good team, they actually have been really good defensively against the pass. And I think the Packers could really look to run the ball a lot in this matchup. My last sit at QB is J.J. McCarthy of the Minnesota Vikings. He's coming off an injury, his high ankle sprain. He's back this week. Carson Wentz is now out for the season. But before getting hurt, I thought McCarthy looked shaky. He did not look like that franchise quarterback the Minnesota Vikings had hoped. Maybe the injury and time to watch will be good for him, but he failed to throw for more than 160 yards in any of his 2 games this year before the injury. He gets the Lions this week. It looks like it could be a high-scoring game, but Detroit's actually been pretty good against the pass. They have yet to allow more than 245 passing yards in a game this year. So I'm not sure McCarthy's going to do much in this one. I would just steer clear of him until he starts to show it well on the field. My sleeper at QB, it's Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins. Really a big surprise last week. He had his first 4-touchdown game of the season, and it was against a very good Falcons pass defense. They've been very good against the pass this year. You just never know what you're going to get with Tua. But I think maybe he can build on last week, and he gets a poor Ravens secondary this week. The Dolphins are going to need to score some points in this matchup, in my opinion, if they hope to win the game, stay in the game. So I think Tua is going to get plenty of chances to air it out against Baltimore, who allows the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks this year. They have allowed 250 plus passing yards 3 or 4 games as well. So Tua could be a good spot start if you're looking for a bye week replacement or injury fill-in. Let's move on to the running back position. We'll start with the starts, and my first one is Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals. He's really finally starting to get it going after a slow start to the season, finally looking like that back many fantasy owners hope they got when they drafted him. He's 12th overall in fantasy running back scoring his last 3 games. He has run 23 times for 181 yards and a touchdown his last 2 games. He gets the Bears this week. They've allowed the 8th most fantasy points to running backs. The Bears allowed the Ravens to run for 177 yards against them last week. So I like Brown to have a big showing once again in week 9. My next start at running back is Kamani Vidal of the Los Angeles Chargers. Vidal hit the 100-yard mark last week, giving him 100-yard games 2 of his last 3. He's clearly emerged as the lead back in the Chargers offense with Omarion Hampton out. He also has 19-plus fantasy points 2 of 3 games, and he has 8 catches his last 3 games. So he's getting some work in the passing game too, which helps his floor. He plays Tennessee this week, a team that has allowed 160-plus rushing yards 3 or 4 games. Tennessee also allows the 3rd most fantasy points to running backs. Vidal, I think, is a great play in week 9. My last start at running backs, DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears, another back. He's really been red hot lately, and the Bears haven't been throwing the ball as well, but they've been running it really well lately, and I think this bodes well for Swift and Kyle Monangai going forward. Swift is actually 6th overall in fantasy running back scoring his last 3 games. He has 100-yard games 2 of 3. He gets the Bengals this week. They've allowed the most fantasy points to running backs on the season. They gave up 254 rushing yards last week. I like both Bears backs in this matchup, but Swift especially, I think he's going to have a big game in week 9. Let's move on to the sits now at running back, and my first one's Alvin Kamara of the Saints. He's really been a bust this year. I thought he was going to have a pretty productive season, but he has not been good despite being the lead back in this offense. He has fewer than double-digit fantasy points 3 or 4 games. He has not topped 35 rushing yards in 4 games as well, and he has yet to have a 100-yard rushing game this year. Now he plays the Rams this week. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to running backs and fewer than 100 rushing yards 4 of 5 games. I would not start Kamara based off his name and past production. He's just not getting it done right now. So I would look at other options if you have them. My next sit at running back is Rico Dowdle of the Carolina Panthers. He played just 36% of the snaps last week, his lowest total since week 2. So the return of Chuba Hubbard has really cut into the playing time of Dowdle lately. It's a little concerning for me, and especially this week against Green Bay. They have allowed more than 100 rushing yards, just 1 game all season. They also allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs. I think Dowdle's a scary play in this matchup. And again, just like my previous pick with Alvin Kamara, I would consider sitting Dowdle in week 9. My last sit at running back is J.K. Dobbins of the Denver Broncos. He had a big game last week, his 2nd 100-yard rushing game of the season. He lost out on some goal line work to R.J. Harvey, though. That was a little concerning to me. Harvey looked good in the game. Maybe he ends up getting some more work going forward. And Dobbins has fewer than double-digit fantasy points 2 of 3 games. He's been a little down lately despite that big game last week. He gets Houston this week. They completely shut down Christian McCaffrey last week. That was a great showing by that defense. He held the 49ers rushing attack to just 48 yards, and they allow the 8th fewest fantasy points to running backs this year. So Dobbins might have a down game in this matchup. My sleeper at running back is going to be Bam Knight of the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals actually released Michael Carter this week. They're talking about re-signing him, so he could be back on the roster. But either way, Knight is clearly the man in the Cardinals backfield right now because of injuries, and he's played pretty well. He has touchdowns 2 of 3 games, and at least 9 fantasy points all 3 games. He plays Dallas this week in what could be a high-scoring game. They allow the second most fantasy points to running backs on the year and at least 136 rushing yards 5 straight games. So I think Knight could end up having his best yardage game of the season. Maybe he finds the end zone again in week 9 as well. Moving on to the receiver position. We'll go with the starts there. And my first one is DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Metcalf has done very well in finding the end zone this year. He isn't posting huge numbers, but he's been very consistent. He has touchdowns all but 2 games. He has at least 11 fantasy points all but a game as well. He gets the Colts this week. The Steelers are going to need to score some points to keep up with that Colts offense. I mentioned Daniel Jones earlier in the show. And Indy also allows the 5th most fantasy points to receivers. So I think if Pittsburgh's going to have success in this matchup, it's going to be throwing the ball. And I think Metcalf could be heavily targeted in week 9. My next start at receiver is Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. Waddle had 5 catches for 99 yards and a touchdown last week against a really good Falcons secondary. I actually had Waddle on my sits last week, and he proved me wrong against a good Falcons secondary. It was a really impressive performance for him. I got that one wrong, so I'm going to move him to my start list this week. Waddle has 95 or more yards, 3 or 4 games. I think he's becoming a must start after that showing last week, especially this week against Baltimore. They allow the 2nd most fantasy points to receivers. My last start is Marvin Harrison of the Arizona Cardinals. He really remains inconsistent, frustrating fantasy player, but he does have 3 games with at least 13 plus fantasy points. He's capable of the big game any given week as the top receiver in this Cardinals offense. Kyler Murray is expected to return as well. Should be a high-scoring game with Dallas, who allow the most fantasy points to receivers on the year, and they have allowed 2 300-yard passing games as well. I think Harrison could have one of his big games in week 9. Moving on to my sits now at receiver. My first one's Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills. He's pretty much disappeared since a huge week 1 performance. He got fantasy owners all excited after that week 1 game. This is finally going to be that breakout season for Coleman, but guess what? He has 1 touchdown since the season opener, and he has not topped 50 yards in a single game since then. I know this could be a high-scoring game with the Chiefs this week. Could be a very exciting game to watch, but I just think Coleman's too hard to trust for me to throw in my lineup, especially against a Chiefs secondary that allows the 6th fewest fantasy points to receivers. My next sit at receiver is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. He had a good game last week. He caught 7 passes for 63 yards on 9 targets. He's still been up and down throughout the season, though. He has less than double-digit fantasy points 2 of 5 games, and hasn't had a 100-yard game since week 1. He gets Miami, who's actually been really good against the pass this year. They allow the fewest fantasy points to receivers. They've allowed less than 180 passing yards 3 of 4 games. Lamar Jackson's going to return. This bodes well for the passing game, but I think they're going to have success running the ball more so in this game, so Flowers could have a down showing. My last sit at receiver is actually any Packers receiver you have. I'm just worried about them in terms of playing time. I think a lot of these guys are going to play, and you just don't know who's going to go off big. Christian Watson returned last week from his torn ACL suffered last year. He played a role. He played 56% of the snaps, had a pretty good game, but these guys are just cutting into each other's playing time now. Romeo Doubs plays the most, but he still is not getting a ton of weekly targets despite being on the field the most. Rookie Matthew Golden has shown flashes, but he's been really inconsistent. Again, he doesn't get a ton of weekly snaps in comparison to other starters around the league. Then you have Dontavion Wicks, who's had a few good games as well, but then disappeared in others. And Watson is still not going to play a full workload just yet, in my opinion. And then on top of that, the Packers get the Panthers this week, who allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points to receivers this year. So I'm just avoiding the Packers receivers at this point till one of these guys emerges. I think it's going to be hard to trust any of them. They're really going to be boom or bust. My sleeper at receivers, Alec Pierce of the Indianapolis Colts. Pierce has played at least 81% of the snaps 3 straight games. He is the top big play threat in this Colts passing game. He averages 23.9 yards per reception his last 3 games. He showed some big-time big play ability. He gets Pittsburgh this week. They allow the 4th most fantasy points to receivers. Pittsburgh has also allowed at least 250 passing yards all but 2 games. I think Pierce is going to make some big plays in this matchup. Could be a good spot play for fantasy owners. Let's move on to the tight end position. Now I'll give you 2 starts, 2 sits, and a sleeper at tight end. My start My first one is Kyle Pitts of the Atlanta Falcons. Drake London's still hurting. I'm not sure if he's going to play. Even if he plays, Pitts has been targeted a lot lately. I think it's very encouraging for his fantasy production. He was the most targeted player in the passing game last week for the Falcons as well. He has been targeted 19 times his last 2 games. He has 13 plus fantasy points, 3 or 4 games. He gets the Patriots, who have struggled against a tight end this year. They allow the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends. I think Pitts is going to get a lot of work again here. He's a top 10 fantasy tight end, in my opinion, for week 9. My next start at tight end is Jake Ferguson of Dallas Cowboys. He did not catch a pass last week. Just a huge disappointment. I don't think anyone saw this coming. He's been so good all year. But remember, he had at least 12 fantasy points, 6 straight games before last week, and 3 of those games were 20-plus fantasy points. So he's been really good throughout the year. Don't get down on him over a game. He gets the Cardinals this week. I've mentioned them a few different times this matchup. I think it's going to be a high-scoring game. Cardinals also allow the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends. Look for Ferguson to rebound in a big way. My sits at tight end. My first one's Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots. He did score a touchdown last week, but that was his only catch in the game. He has posted some decent fantasy numbers this year, but it was really early in the season. He had double-digit fantasy points 3 of his first 4 games. He has not topped 8 fantasy points in a game since week 4, though, and he gets Atlanta this week. They're really good against the pass, and they've completely shut down the tight end this year. Just shut down the opposing tight ends. They've done next to nothing. They allow the fewest fantasy points to tight ends for the entire season, and the Falcons' pass defense has yet to allow more than 200 passing yards in a game this year. I think Henry's going to struggle here. I'd go with other options at tight end. My last sit at tight end is Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills. I actually had him as a start last week, and he disappointed mainly because he didn't play much. He returned from his injury, his quad injury. He played just 22% of the snaps, though, and he had just a catch. Actually, he had an oblique injury. I'm sorry. I said quad injury. It was an oblique injury. He had just a catch for 23 yards last week on 3 targets in week 8, and he played just 22% of the snaps, like I mentioned. So just really hard to trust. Again, it could be a high-scoring game with the Chiefs, but I'm steering clear of Kincaid at this point. He needs to be on the field more, and he needs to show me something before I'm throwing him back in my lineup, especially against Kansas City this week, who have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to tight ends for the season. They have allowed 200 or less passing yards 3 straight and 6 of 7 games. Buffalo might have to rely on James Cook and the legs of Josh Allen in this matchup as well. I think the passing game might have a few struggles in week 9 for Buffalo. My sleeper at tight end, my last pick of the week, is Colston Loveland of the Bears. He hasn't exactly been off the charts with Cole Kmet out, but he does have 3 receptions each of his last 2 games. He's been targeted 9 times during those 2 games, so that's encouraging. He gets a horrible Bengals defense this week. Cincinnati allows the most fantasy points to tight ends this year and at least 247 passing yards all but a game. I would not be surprised if Loveland has the best game of his young career. Those are my start, sits, and sleepers for week 9 of the fantasy football season. Good luck to all of you in your games this week. Hope you have a lot of success. This has been Jeff Paur for RealTime Fantasy Sports.